Picture waking up to the sound of wind screaming against your windows. Not ordinary wind. A roar that does not stop. Outside, the ocean has risen past the dunes, past your street, past your front porch. It is inside your house now, and it is still coming. You grab your children and climb to the second floor, but the water follows. You can hear your neighbor's house being torn from its foundation. And the worst part? This is not a hurricane. There was no warning, no evacuation order, just a weather forecast that said chance of rain and cloudy. This was March 1962, and for 5 terrifying tides over 3 endless days, the Atlantic Ocean would redraw the American coastline forever. The Ash Wednesday storm did not arrive with the fanfare of a named hurricane. It crept in like a thief, but before it was done, it would kill 40 people, injure over 1,000, destroy nearly 2,000 homes, and damage another 45,000. From the Outer Banks of North Carolina to the shores of Long Island, entire communities were swallowed by the sea. If you lived through it, you never forgot it. If you have never heard of it, prepare yourself. This is the story of the storm that broke America's coast. It started as nothing. On Sunday, March 4th, 1962, a low-pressure system formed off the coast of Florida. Nothing unusual. Weather forecasters barely noticed it. The Monday morning forecast for the Atlantic coast was almost boring. Chance of rain, cloudy, and Tuesday, cool and cloudy. No advance warnings, no radio bulletins, no evacuation plans. Families went about their business. Shopkeepers opened their stores. Fishermen prepared their boats. In Norfolk, the morning newspaper offered encouraging news that no significant snow was expected for Hampton Roads. Housewives planned their grocery shopping. Children walked to school. The big news that week was Gary Powers, the U-2 spy pilot who had been shot down over the Soviet Union and later released. He was testifying before a Senate committee. That is what people were talking about, not the weather. Down on the Outer Banks, Stockton Stocky Midget, an 84-year-old lifelong resident, noticed the northeast wind had been blowing steadily for a couple of days. Small craft warnings were posted north of Hatteras, but that was normal for early March. Nothing to worry about. Years later, he would recall that they did not have the modern technologies we have today, and that the weather on the radio was all local. But something unusual was happening in the atmosphere. 3 pressure systems were colliding. A cold front was sweeping down from the north. A low-pressure area was moving up from the south. And a blocking high-pressure ridge over New England would trap everything in place. At the same time, the moon was at perigee, its closest point to Earth in its monthly orbit. The sun and moon were aligned perfectly. These astronomical conditions created what meteorologists call a perigean spring tide, the highest tides possible. And they only occur every 2 years. The storm had no idea it was supposed to move along. Normal nor'easters blow through in a day, maybe 2. This one got stalled. It stalled 100 miles offshore and began to spin. And spin. And spin. For 3 days and 5 high tides, it pounded the same stretch of coastline with relentless fury. By Tuesday evening, March 6th, residents along the coast knew something was wrong. The wind had picked up throughout the day, blowing from the northeast at 40, 50, even 60 miles per hour. Rain lashed against windows in horizontal sheets. But this was the mid-Atlantic coast. People here had seen nor'easters before. They figured it would blow through by morning. It didn't. That night, the first high tide arrived with devastating force. Waves 25 to 30 feet high crashed against sand dunes that had protected coastal towns for generations. The dunes crumbled. The ocean poured through. In Ocean City, Maryland, the protective barrier was breached by the first of 5 tidal surges. Residents watching from their windows saw the ocean meeting the bay for the first time. Their town was suddenly an island within an island. Down in Nag's Head on the Outer Banks, the water rose so fast that families woke to find it already inside their homes. There was no gradual flooding, no time to move furniture or grab valuables. One moment the floor was dry. The next, you were standing in 3 feet of freezing seawater, and it was rising by the minute. 5 high tides of terror. Here's what made this storm truly catastrophic. A normal storm hits and moves on. The tide comes in, causes damage, and then recedes. People can assess, clean up, and prepare for what comes next. But the Ash Wednesday storm did not move. It sat there, spinning, relentless. The first high tide battered the coast on Tuesday night. Then the tide went out slightly, but the storm did not let up. Wednesday morning brought the second high tide, and the water came back higher than before. The dunes that had survived the first assault collapsed during the second. Wednesday afternoon, a third devastating tide. Wednesday night, a fourth. Thursday morning, a fifth. Each one built on the destruction of the last. The bays and sounds behind the barrier islands had no time to drain between tides. Water that should have flowed back to the ocean had nowhere to go. It just accumulated. In Chincoteague, Virginia, 6 feet of water covered Main Street. In Sea Isle City, New Jersey, residents watched refrigerators, beds, and entire walls with pictures still hanging on them floating down their streets. And through it all, the wind never stopped. Gusts reached 70 to 80 miles per hour, hurricane force. But this was not a hurricane. It was something worse, because nobody saw it coming. Ships at sea. While coastal residents fought for their lives, sailors on the Atlantic faced their own nightmare. 200 miles southeast of Charleston, a yacht called the Guinevere began taking on water. 3 people clung to the vessel as waves tossed it like a toy. They were rescued, barely, by ships that risked their own crews to save them. But not everyone was so lucky. Off Cape Hatteras, in the area mariners have called the graveyard of the Atlantic for centuries, a 500-foot Liberian tanker broke completely in 2. The ship snapped apart under the relentless pounding of the waves. 1 crew member was crushed against the hull while trying to launch a lifeboat. The rest were eventually rescued by a passing cruise ship and the Navy. But the terror of watching your ship break apart beneath you while surrounded by 50-foot waves is something no survivor ever forgot. 2 fishing trawlers with 9 people aboard went missing and were never found. 2 freighters washed ashore in New Jersey. The Chesapeake Lightship, a floating lighthouse stationed east of Cape Henry, Virginia, was damaged by a 50-foot wave and had to be evacuated. 50 feet. A wave taller than a 4-story building. The Coast Guard sent another ship to take its place, because even in the worst storm in generations, the lights had to stay on for other mariners. The destruction. Nobody expected. In Atlantic City, the famous Steel Pier, that iconic landmark where the diving horses performed, crumbled under the assault. A 100-foot barge slammed into it, tearing away a quarter-mile section. The tank where the horses dove disappeared into the churning sea. The wave sensor on the pier, which should have recorded the storm's fury for history, was destroyed when the tide reached nearly 10 feet above normal. The storm literally erased its own measurements. Down at Beach Haven on Long Beach Island, a Navy destroyer, the USS Monson, was torn from its moorings and beached. A 2,000-ton warship, designed to survive combat, sat helpless in the sand while the homes around it were swept away. The image became the defining photograph of the storm. American military, might, humbled by American weather. Long Beach Island was cut into 5 pieces. The ocean punched through in multiple places, creating new inlets to Barnegat Bay. 80% of structures on the island were damaged or destroyed. In Harvey Cedars, 183 out of 352 homes were completely destroyed. The rest suffered severe damage. An 80-foot wide channel, 3 to 7 feet deep, was carved straight through the town from ocean to bay. Some homes knocked off their foundations were found up to a mile inland. One man searching for his cottage found it 4 blocks from where it had stood, completely intact, sitting in someone else's yard. At the Back Bay Wildlife Refuge in Virginia, an assistant refuge manager who had survived 3 hurricanes in the area said he had never seen anything like this storm. When the winds finally died down, he drove to the top of the dunes to survey the damage. A wave crashed in and came almost to the crest before it dissipated. He shook off his drowsiness in a hurry. In the days that followed, he found a refrigerator washed up on the beach, a freezer with food still partially frozen inside, a complete set of encyclopedias, a skiff in perfect condition with the owner's name and address stamped on a metal tag. That skiff had washed all the way down from Chincoteague, near the Maryland line. He called the owner, who drove down and picked it up. That's how far and how randomly the storm scattered people's lives across the coast. The debris that washed into Barnegat Bay from destroyed Long Beach Island homes kept appearing for years afterward. Pieces of people's lives, their furniture, their walls, their memories, surfacing randomly, as if the bay was slowly returning what it had stolen, one fragment at a time. When heroes emerged from the flood, there was no FEMA in 1962, no organized disaster response network, no smartphones to call for help. When the water rose and the power went out and the phones went dead, people were on their own. And that's when ordinary Americans became extraordinary. In Nags Head, a man named Ife Priest grabbed his road grader, a massive construction vehicle, and drove it through the flooded streets. He could not count how many people he rescued because he lost track. He would pull up to a house, people would climb on, he would take them to higher ground, then go back for more. All day, all night, again the next day. In Kill Devil Hills, men launched small skiffs into waves that would terrify professional sailors. They rowed from house to house, checking every structure, pulling people from second-story windows and rooftops. When they returned home, they changed into dry clothes and went right back out. There was no time to rest. People were dying. Sam Beecham and Bill Quidley in Kitty Hawk found a skiff that had washed up on the highway. They attached a small outboard motor and spent hours plucking survivors from rooftops and flooded cars. Quidley, an Army specialist, was later awarded the Army Commendation Medal for heroism. He was not even supposed to be there. He was home on leave. In Sea Isle City, the Coast Guard responded to a fire at Mercy Hospital. Their vehicle was swamped by floodwaters, so they waded 2.5 miles through freezing water, put out the fire, and waded 2.5 miles back. Nobody complained. Nobody quit. You did what needed to be done, because that is what Americans did. The cold that made everything worse. It wasn't just the wind and the water. It was the cold. Water temperatures hovered around 34 degrees. Air temperatures weren't much warmer. When people fled their flooded homes, they waded through water cold enough to kill. Inland, away from the coastal flooding, the storm was dumping historic amounts of snow. This was a full-blown blizzard across the mountains of Virginia and North Carolina. The Shenandoah Valley received nearly 2 feet of snow. Big Meadows in Shenandoah National Park recorded 42 inches. In Winchester, Virginia, 23 inches fell, a record at the time. Snow fell as far south as Alabama, and temperatures plunged to freezing across Florida. The storm didn't care if you lived on the beach or in the mountains. It found a way to make everyone miserable. On the eastern shore of Maryland and Delaware, the high waves killed more than 1 million broiler chickens when power outages stopped incubators and heating systems. Saltwater intrusion damaged agricultural fields for years afterward. Farmers who had nothing to do with the coast still lost their livelihoods. In Long Beach Township, Police Chief Herbert Leonetti set out to check on residents in Holgate at the southern tip of the island. The four-wheel drive truck he was riding in sank into a washed-out section of road. The water temperature was 34 degrees. Rescuers managed to pull him out and get him to a nearby house, but it was too late. Chief Leonetti suffered a massive heart attack and died. He was 52 years old. His son Jim had asked to come along that morning, but his father said no. He told him he would be back. It was the last conversation they ever had. Down the coast, a group attempted to rescue elderly residents by boat. A massive wave flipped their vessel. 9 people formed a human chain and tried to walk through the flooded marshes to safety. One elderly woman sat down and said she could not go any further. Panic spread. When rescuers finally reached safety hours later, 4 of the elderly people were gone. 2 bodies were found later, 30 miles away in Ocean City. The other 2 were never recovered. A town that vanished. In Holgate, New Jersey, at the southern tip of Long Beach Island, nearly 2 blocks of beachfront property simply vanished. Not damaged, not flooded, gone. Washed into the sea as if they had never existed. Where homes once stood, there was only sand and debris and an ocean that had moved its boundary inland by hundreds of feet. The community of Harvey Cedars took perhaps the worst beating. When the skies finally cleared and residents could see what remained, many broke down crying. More than half the town was destroyed. Foundations stood empty where homes had been. Boats rested on roofs. Cars were buried completely under sand. The ocean and bay had met in the middle of town, and everything in between was devastated. Federal officials actually considered restoring the coast to its natural state. Just letting nature win, abandoning the barrier islands, and letting the sea have what it had tried to take. The idea was seriously discussed at the highest levels of government. Misty's Kitchen. But amid all the destruction, there was one story that captured America's heart. On Chincoteague Island, Virginia, where the floodwaters had risen 6 feet deep in places, there lived a famous pony named Misty. You might remember her from the book Misty of Chincoteague or the 1961 movie. She was beloved across the country, a symbol of the wild ponies that had roamed these barrier islands for centuries. When the storm surge came, Misty's owners brought her inside their house. She spent the worst of the storm standing in their kitchen while the waters raged outside. Several of the wild Chincoteague ponies drowned in the flood, but Misty survived. And just a few days after the storm ended, she gave birth to a foal. The family named the baby Stormy. The story became national news. In the midst of so much loss, here was new life. Here was hope. Marguerite Henry wrote another book about it. The storm had taken so much, but it could not take everything. The recovery that shouldn't have happened. In the immediate aftermath, the situation seemed hopeless. Electricity was out everywhere. Water systems were destroyed. Sewer systems were wrecked. Phone lines were down. Roads were buried under sand or washed away completely. Long Beach Island was cut into multiple pieces. The outer banks were severed by new inlets. But in Ocean City, Maryland, something remarkable happened. An ad hoc network of CB radio hobbyists became the town's communication lifeline. These amateur radio operators coordinated rescue efforts, communicating with volunteers and sending messages to trapped residents. They told people to hang white sheets from their windows as signals so rescuers could find them in the chaos. By Wednesday evening, most Ocean City residents had been evacuated. Many returned to find their furniture gone and their living rooms completely submerged. Some houses had been swept entirely off their foundations and deposited blocks away. But they were alive, largely because ordinary citizens with hobby radios had stepped up when the official systems failed. The National Guard arrived with drinking water. President Kennedy declared multiple states disaster areas. The Army Corps of Engineers began emergency beach replenishment. Police and National Guard patrolled the damaged barrier islands to prevent looting. Initial damage estimates exceeded $200 million, which would be nearly $2 billion today. Some thought the shore towns would never recover. Real estate developers wondered if the coastal market had simply disappeared. But then something remarkable happened, something that still defines these communities today. People rebuilt. They did not have flood insurance, most of them. FEMA did not exist. If you lost your house, you lost your house. If you lost your tools, you lost your tools. There was no government bailout coming to make things right. But neighbors helped neighbors. Families who lost everything were taken in by families who still had something. Churches became shelters. Community halls became coordination centers. People showed up from inland towns to help dig out, to clear debris, to simply stand beside their coastal neighbors and say, "You are not alone." In Ocean City, Maryland, less than 3 months after the storm, the town reopened for business on Memorial Day weekend. 3 months. From total devastation to welcoming tourists. That's not just resilience, that's defiance. What the storm taught us. The Ash Wednesday storm changed everything about how America deals with coastal disasters. It exposed the total lack of warning systems for non-tropical storms. Weather forecasters had completely failed to predict either its intensity or its duration. The storm literally destroyed the instruments that were supposed to measure it. In the years that followed, the government invested heavily in weather satellites and computer modeling. The National Weather Service expanded its capabilities. Warning systems were developed specifically for nor'easters. The storm that nobody saw coming ensured that future storms would be tracked from birth to death. But there was another lesson, one that many people forgot. The Army Corps of Engineers recommended against rebuilding in many of the hardest-hit areas. They warned that the same thing would happen again, that the sea always wins eventually, that barrier islands are meant to move, to shift, to be reshaped by storms. Nobody listened. Instead, shore communities rebuilt bigger than before. Where modest cottages once stood, larger homes rose. Where empty lots had provided buffer zones, new construction filled every available inch. Property values that should have collapsed instead skyrocketed. The barrier islands became some of the most valuable real estate in America. 50 years later, Hurricane Sandy would prove the Army Corps right. But that's another story for another day. The memories that never fade. Ask anyone who lived through the Ash Wednesday storm, and they'll tell you the same thing. They remember the sound first. Not just the wind, though the wind was relentless. It was the sound of houses breaking apart. The sound of waves hitting where waves had never reached before. The sound of neighbors calling for help in the darkness. They remember the cold, wading through that freezing water, the weight of wet clothes, the fear that you might not make it to somewhere warm before hypothermia set in. They remember the smell, salt water and sewage and fuel oil and fear, the smell of a coast being torn apart and everything man had built being exposed as temporary. But most of all, they remember the people. The stranger who appeared with a boat when there was no other way out. The neighbor who opened their door when yours was underwater. The volunteers who showed up from towns they had never visited to help people they had never met. One survivor put it simply, "We were not thinking about the future, whether we would have a home or jobs to go back to. We were wondering if we were going to survive." They survived. Most of them. 40 souls were lost along that 500-mile stretch of coastline. 40 families that would never be whole again. 40 empty chairs at dinner tables, 40 reasons why every storm that followed carried a shadow of what came before. The legacy. The Ash Wednesday storm of 1962 remains, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, the largest East Coast winter storm in history in terms of land lost and homes damaged or destroyed. Nothing before or since has quite matched its combination of power and duration. Today, sea levels along the mid-Atlantic coast are 8 to 12 inches higher than they were in 1962. The coastline has been developed far more densely. If the same storm hit tomorrow, with the same conditions, the damage would be catastrophic beyond anything seen in that era. Scientists say it is not a matter of if, but when. Yet people still flock to the shore, still build their dream homes on barrier islands, still watch the weather forecast, and assume that if something bad is coming, someone will tell them in time to get out. Maybe they are right. Warning systems are better now. Building codes are stronger. Emergency response is more organized. Or maybe the sea is just waiting for its next chance. A silver lining in the sand. Not everything the storm did was destructive, at least not in the long run. On Assateague Island, off the coast of Maryland and Virginia, developers had big plans. 5,000 private lots had been zoned and sold for resort development. Roads were being laid. The first structures were going up. In a few years, Assateague would have been lined with vacation homes and hotels, just like every other barrier island on the Atlantic coast. The Ash Wednesday storm ended all of that. It destroyed every structure on the island. It tore the roads apart. It made the developers' plans literally impossible. And so, in 1965, Assateague Island National Seashore was designated by the National Park Service instead. Today, it remains one of the last undeveloped barrier islands on the East Coast. Wild horses still roam its beaches. Seabirds nest in its dunes. Visitors come not for hotels and boardwalks, but for nature preserved exactly as it was meant to be. The storm that destroyed so much also saved something irreplaceable. Sometimes nature knows best, even when it is teaching us the lesson in the hardest possible way. If you lived through the Ash Wednesday storm, or if your parents or grandparents told you stories about those 5 terrifying tides, drop a comment below. Share what you remember. These stories matter. They remind us that the coast we love is borrowed, not owned. That nature allows us to live there, but nature can take it back whenever it chooses. Hit subscribe to keep these American stories alive. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And the next time you are standing on a beach, looking out at that beautiful, peaceful ocean, remember March 1962. Remember what the water can do when it decides to remind us who is really in charge. Until next time, hold those memories close. They are worth more than any beachfront property.